Greetings, loved ones. Neglect accounts for over 3/4 of confirmed child abuse cases in the United States. Far more than physical or sexual abuse, but it continues to receive less attention from practitioners, researchers, and the media. Some reasons may be that neglect is not well understood and is difficult to identify, prevent, and treat effectively. Today we're going to look into this more in depth. These are important messages, so please help us get them out. Subscribe to our channel, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Hit the like button and the notification bell, and please share these messages with others. Let's talk about acts of omission, and then we're going to talk about give an overview of what is child neglect. As I said a minute ago, neglect accounts for over 3/4 of confirmed cases of child abuse in the United States, and it continues to receive less attention from practitioners, researchers, and the media. Some reasons may be that neglect is not well understood and it is difficult to identify, prevent, and treat effectively. Today and in following episodes, we will address the scope of the problem of child neglect as well as its consequences. And we're going to review definitions and strategies for assessing neglect. We're going to present lessons learned about prevention and intervention. And we're going to suggest sources of training and informational support. Neglect is by far the most common form of abuse. More than 538,000 children were neglected in 2010 in the United States, accounting for about 78% of all unique victims of child abuse. In addition, neglect was either the sole cause or one of the contributors to more than 68% of the 1,560 child abuse-related deaths in 2010. This is according to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services in a 2011 report. These statistics include only children who came to the attention of state child protective service agencies. The National Incidence Study, NIS, of child abuse and neglect, which generates broader estimates by gathering data from multiple resources. This generally shows higher numbers of abuse. The NIS-4 uses data from 2005 to 2006 to show that more than 770,000 children were neglected, and accounting for about 77% of all children harmed or endangered by abuse. And this is written out by Sedlak in 2010 study report. While the incidence of other maltreatment types has declined in recent years, the persistently high rates of abuse and neglect point to the need of more effective prevention and intervention in cases of neglect. So let's define child neglect. Both federal and state laws provide basic definitions of child abuse and child neglect. The Federal Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, called CAPTA, as amended by the CAPTA Reauthorization Act of 2010, defines child abuse and neglect at minimum as any recent act or failure to act on the part of a parent or caretaker which results in death, serious physical or emotional harm, sexual abuse or exploitation, or an act or failure to act which presents an imminent risk of serious harm. Neglect is commonly defined in state law as the failure of a parent or other person with responsibility for the child to provide needed food, clothing, shelter, medical care, or supervision to the degree that the child's health, safety, and well-being are threatened with harm. Some states specifically mention types of neglect in their statutes, such as educational neglect, medical neglect, and abandonment. In addition, some states include exceptions for determining neglect, such as religious exemptions for medical neglect and financial considerations for physical neglect. Neglect definitions are impacted by the accepted standards of care for children and the role of communities in family lives. Some issues that are taken into account when defining neglect and standards of neglect of care, I'll say that again, when defining neglect and standards of care include harm to the child, parents' ability or intent, families' concrete resources, community norms, and availability of community resources. Difficulties in creating specific definitions of neglect contribute to the lack of consistency in research on neglect as well as CPS responses to neglect. The different way children might be neglected also makes it difficult to define such a complex issue. So let's talk about types of neglect. And although state laws vary regarding the types of neglect included in definitions, here are the most recognized categories of neglect. There's physical neglect, abandoning the child or refusing to accept custody, not providing for basic needs like nutrition, hygiene, or appropriate clothing. Then there's medical neglect, delaying or denying recommended health care for the child. Inadequate supervision, leaving the child unsupervised, depending on the length of time and child's age and maturity, not protecting the child from safety hazards, providing inadequate caregivers, or engaging in harmful behavior. Then there is emotional neglect, isolating the child, not providing affection or emotional support, exposing the child to domestic violence or substance abuse. And then we have educational neglect, which is failing to enroll the child in school or homeschool, ignoring special education needs, and permitting chronic absenteeism from school. So now that we've talked about the different types of neglect, let's talk about the consequences of neglect. And although the initial impact may not be as obvious as physical or sexual abuse, the consequences of child neglect are just as serious. Because the effects of neglect are cumulative, long-term research like that being performed by the longitudinal studies of child abuse and neglect funded by the Children's Bureau helps us better understand outcomes for children affected by neglect. Research shows that child neglect can have a negative impact in the following areas: health and physical development, such as malnourishment, impaired brain development, delays in growth or failure to thrive; intellectual and cognitive development, poor academic performance, delayed or impaired language development; emotional and psychological development, such as deficiencies in self-esteem, attachment, or trust; social and behavior development. This is interpersonal relationship problems, aggression, and conduct disorders. The impacts in these areas are interrelated. Problems in one developmental area may influence growth in another area. In addition, research indicates that experiencing neglect along with other forms of maltreatment worsens the impact. However, the impact of neglect can vary based on the child's age, the presence and strength of protective factors, the frequency, duration, and severity of the neglect, and the relationship between the child and the caregiver. So let's talk about trauma and neglect. While trauma is often discussed in terms of witnessing or being harmed by an intensely threatening event, one or more multiple experiences of neglect can also have a traumatic effect, especially in severe cases. One recent study found that, like physical and sexual abuse, neglected children show signs of post-traumatic stress disorder and other traumatic symptoms, and that neglected children experienced adverse brain development and neuropsychological and psychosocial outcomes. There is a fatal neglect. That's something that's titled fatal neglect. A child's death is the most tragic consequence of neglect, and neglect causes or contributes to roughly 2/3 of all child maltreatment-related deaths. Victims of fatal neglect are more likely to be aged 7 or younger. The most common reasons for fatal neglect are supervision neglect, chronic physical neglect, and medical neglect. Neglect fatalities can be difficult to identify due to lack of definitive evidence, limited investigative and training resources, and differing interpretations of child maltreatment definitions. According to the CDC, over half of all the children in the world, that's 1 billion children ages 2 to 17 years old, experience violence every year. The question is not if you'll encounter a victim of violence. The question before God is, what will you do when you do encounter them? You are called, we are all called to be champions for justice, and those who suffer violence, they need to know that those who love them and those who don't even know them will reach out and give them the help before it's too late. These are important messages. Please help them get them out. Subscribe to our channel, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, hit the like button, hit the notification bell, and share these messages with others. If you are suffering violence, I want you to listen to me. You need to know that you are valued, you are loved, You are intelligent, and yes, you are worthy. God does not want you to suffer violence. He wants you to live free from violence in peace and tranquility. There is a way out. You're not trapped. There is a way out. It is not your fault, no matter what anyone says. Abuse is not love. Someone says they love you and abuses you, they are lying to you. And most of all, I want you to know that you're not alone. If you're a victim of violence, please reach out to someone today. If you find yourself in a dangerous situation, just dial 911. If you know of a child suffering violence, tell the authorities. You do not need to investigate, just tell the authorities. In our next episode, we will talk about risk factors for child neglect. Until then, God bless you.